I was born in England in 1959, my father Aziz Radwan from Egypt, and my mother Mary Magson from England. My father was a Muslim, but he wasn't very religious. However, when he married my mother, he insisted she convert to Islam, and we were raised as Muslims. When we were young, my father hired a Tunisian sheikh to teach us Arabic and to memorize the Quran. I wasn't very religious in my youth, until I approached the age of 20 when I became confused about my identity. I asked myself questions such as, who am I? What is the meaning of life? What is my purpose? Then a series of events caused me to review the religion of my birth. The first was the Islamic Revolution in Iran. I remember watching the battles in the streets of Tehran on television and the courage of the people in front of the heavily armed guard of the Shah. I was also aware that Islam played an important role in motivating them. I was faced by another example of the power of faith when my close friend came back from a trip to proclaim that he had found Jesus and become a Christian after having been an atheist. My friend tried to convert me, but when he explained its doctrines such as the Trinity, original sin, and atonement, I knew they were concepts I couldn't believe in. Not long after this came another event in this series, when I saw the famous singer Cat Stevens on television announcing that he had embraced Islam and retired from the music industry. The public was surprised that he would turn his back on fame and fortune for the sake of Islam, but it aroused my curiosity and encouraged me to look again at my religion. The last episode in this series of events was my visit to Egypt with my father. We stayed at my uncle's apartment in Cairo. He was a religious man, and we soon entered into discussions about religion. He gave me a copy of the Quran and made me promise I would read it. So the next day I sat down to read it as promised, with the intention of just reading a few pages. But I found a certain appeal and comfort in reading it, and I couldn't put it down. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. My mercy envelops all things. If my servants ask you about me, indeed I am close. I respond to the call of he who calls whenever he calls on me. And do not turn your cheek in contempt towards people, nor walk through the earth exultantly. Indeed, God loveth not the arrogant boaster. Be good to parents, to kinfolk, to orphans and the needy, and speak kindly to mankind. We have made you into nations and tribes, so that you get to know one another. The most noble of you in the sight of God is best in conduct. The servants of the merciful walk upon the earth with humility, and when the foolish berate them, they respond with peaceful words. The words affected me emotionally, and I felt a strange force in my heart, and tears rolled down my cheeks. I felt certain it was God speaking to me through these pages, and that I had discovered the meaning of life I had been searching for. I returned to England full of zeal and determination to immerse myself in my faith. When I returned to England, I studied Arabic and Islamic history at the University of London. My specialist subjects were tafsir of the Quran and pre-Islamic poetry. I was keen to learn all I could about Islam, and the university library became my second home. I would study late into the night until the librarians had to ask me to leave at closing time. During the second year at university, I became president of the Islamic Society, and I set up a bookstall for Islamic materials. And I obtained permission from the university authorities to use a room for daily and Friday prayers. I was also keen to call people to Islam outside the university, and I attended Islamic circles in mosques and houses, and became the leader of one of these circles called the Dawah Society. One day, one of my friends invited me to attend a gathering called Jamaat al-Tabligh, a movement aimed at bringing Muslims back to the right path. The meeting was held at a mosque in northern England, and we stayed there for 2 weeks, night and day, isolated from the secular world. We spent every day listening to lectures and only went outside to call local residents to come and listen to the talks. This experience had a profound effect on me, and when it was time to return home, I found my whole focus concentrated on the hereafter, the worship of God, obeying his commands and avoiding his prohibitions. Not only did I perform all the obligatory acts, but also every sunnah and every act of extra worship also. The awakening of my faith coincided with a widespread awakening amongst Muslims in England in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Amongst the causes of this awakening were a number of emotive factors in the Muslim world at the time, such as the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and the Sabra and Shatila massacre. But perhaps the most important of these factors was the funding of Islamic Dawah by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This led to the spread of Salafi ideology in every corner of the world, and the emergence of political groups such as jihadists and caliphate movements. During these years, the number of Muslims rediscovering their faith increased, and our Dawah society became ever more crowded. We organized many activities, including camping trips, museum visits, iftar parties, and the publication of an Islamic magazine that I edited. In 1988, Salman Rushdie wrote his novel The Satanic Verses. I hadn't heard about it until one of our members attended the Dawah Society with some quotes. After reading them, we decided to write letters to the publisher demanding the book be withdrawn due to it insulting the Prophet. The issue stirred the emotions of Muslims and increased their interest in politics, and as a result, many came to adopt more aggressive politics. Among those attending our meeting was Farid Qasim, a spokesman for Hizb ut-Tahrir. He believed the only solution to the problems facing the Ummah was the establishment of the Islamic Caliphate. He was so extreme that he left Hizb ut-Tahrir to form a more radical party called Al-Muhajirun with his colleague Omar Bakri. Islam places great emphasis on marriage, and it is considered half one's religion. As a result, I was often approached by people advising me to get married. Amongst them was an Egyptian woman called Sister Sharifa, who was always at Regent's Park Mosque and seemed to work as an unofficial matchmaker. She would stand by the entrance to the mosque and ask every young girl entering, "Are you married?" If they answered no, then Sister Sharifa would search for a suitable young man for her. Thus it was that she came to my father's house one day with a girl she considered suitable for me. We met her family and we liked each other, and it wasn't long before we were married. I had 5 children in total, but my daughter Huda died in hospital a week after her birth, which caused me enormous pain. However, I told myself that behind every trial is a wisdom and a mercy, and perhaps the reason was my own shortcomings, and so I resolved to strive even harder to be a good Muslim. After graduating from university, I completed postgraduate studies in education and got a job as a teacher at Islamia School, founded by Yusuf Islam. In those days, I was at the height of my faith and very active in the British Muslim community. I spent 15 years as a teacher at Islamia School, and I wrote 2 storybooks for Muslim children and 2 collections of Islamic plays based on traditional Islamic folk tales. When I first joined Islamia School, Sheikh Faisal was the Imam, but it soon became clear that he held some fanatical views, and so the headmaster asked him to resign. He moved to the Brixton Mosque, where he became even more extreme and delivered sermons inciting the killing of Hindus, Christians, Jews, and Americans. It later became apparent that he had influenced one of the London bombers. This led to his imprisonment for 4 years. After that, Sheikh Ahmad Babakar became the Imam of the school. He was a humble and spiritual man belonging to a Sufi tradition. He had a deep knowledge of Islam as well as an engaging and enjoyable style of teaching. One of my friends became a hardline Salafi and gave allegiance to a sheikh who claimed to be the Khalifa. His name was Abu Isa al-Rafa'i. He gave his lectures at the Golban Road Mosque, where he ordered his followers to emigrate to Afghanistan. My friend gave me a declaration from this sheikh and implored me to join him, but the statement was full of extremist views which I rejected completely. So my friend lifted his eyes to the sky and shouted with a trembling voice, "Oh God, bear witness I have delivered the message! Oh God, bear witness I have delivered the message!" I did my best to dissuade him from his deluded beliefs, but he refused to listen, as though he was gripped by a kind of madness. He then travelled to Afghanistan, and I didn't hear from him until one of his friends returned and informed me that he had been killed there during the sectarian fighting between the various jihadi groups. As for the Caliph, he fled to Britain after his defeat, where he continued to give sermons until his death in 2014. I remember on the day of September the 11th, I was teaching at Islamia School when news of the attacks in America came through. I wondered, how could a Muslim commit this terrible crime in the name of God? How could they misunderstand Islam to this extent? My instinctive response was that there was no connection between the acts of these terrorists and the religion of Islam at all. Islam was completely innocent of them. Either they had a false understanding, or they were just using Islam for their corrupt purposes. They must be driven by political or economic grievances. Or perhaps they are suffering from mental illness. However, many of my colleagues and friends claimed that the Zionists and America were behind this crime. We Muslims love conspiracy theories and swallow them easily without evidence. Whether it is the theory that the world is under the control of the Freemasons, or the theory that the logo Coca-Cola, when reversed, says no Muhammad and no Mecca. However, in reality, they reveal our feelings of inadequacy and lack of control over our lives. Conspiracy theories spread at times of weakness and fear, and when it is difficult to face a bitter reality. So we resort to believing in conspiracies to calm our anxieties and to protect our beliefs. But what really shocked me was that some friends tried to justify and defend these attacks, on the grounds that the victims were not innocent because they voted for the infidel regime that is slaughtering Muslims. Although I tried to distance Islam from the actions of groups such as Al-Qaeda, I realized that there is a dilemma here that we do not want to recognize. Namely, that Islamic texts lend themselves to contradictory interpretations. It's true that the interpretation of extremists don't represent the only interpretation, but it is not true to deny their relationship to Islam completely. There were also events in my personal life that took me out of my comfort zone and forced me to review my life and beliefs, including the breakdown of my marriage. But the greatest blow was my eldest son's illness. He had fallen in with a group of youngsters who were smoking cannabis and unfortunately became very ill and suffers to this day from schizophrenia. Every night I begged God to heal my son, just as I had begged him to heal my daughter Huda before she died. But once again my prayers fell on deaf ears. Despite what the Quran says, call on me and I will respond to you, and that God answers the distressed one when he calls upon him and removes the suffering. I consoled myself with the usual explanations that we Muslims use at such times, that it is a test, as the Quran says, to test you to see who is the best in deeds, and that God will reward us for our patience, and that God gives us what we need and not what we want, and that there is a wisdom we cannot perceive, or that it's my own fault. As the Quran says, whatever calamity befalls you, it is because of what your own hands have earned. I must have neglected some duties, and I must remain patient and grateful no matter what befalls me. However, I recalled how the Quran mocks the polytheists for worshipping gods that don't answer them. Who is more astray than one who calls upon other than Allah, who doesn't answer them? And say, call upon those you claim other than Allah. They cannot remove your affliction nor change your condition. I asked myself, does Allah really answer prayers? Does he really remove affliction and calamities? Why do we accept many excuses for Allah's lack of response, but when it comes to the lack of response of the gods of other religions, there's only one reason. It is because they are false. Is there a tangible difference between calling on Allah and calling on Alat and Uzza, or calling on Jesus and the Virgin Mary, or calling on Krishna and Ganesh? I was at Islamia School on the day of the London bombings in 2005, and once again many Muslims rushed to conspiracy theories. They pounced on any excuse to avoid attributing problems to the Islamic texts themselves. Despite the many questions that troubled me, I was, up until that time, certain that Islam was true. But I began to review the text of the Quran in a much more critical way, and not in a devotional way, which only views the Quran through the lens of faith. One of the things that disturbed me most was the concept of eternal torture. The Quran describes it as a place of the most terrible forms of barbaric and cruel torture that will never be eased for a moment, nor will it ever end. Those who disbelieve in our revelations, we will burn them in the fire. Whenever their skins are roasted off, we will exchange them for new skins, so that they keep suffering the torment. They will have suits of flames cut out for them, and on their heads will be poured scorching water. If they beg for relief, they will be granted water like molten brass, which roasts their faces. It will melt their insides and their skins, boiling water that will shred their intestines. Never will the torment be eased off them. Never will they get out. They will remain in it forever. How can you blame someone for simply not being convinced by Islam? Doesn't eternal torture contradict justice and reason, never mind mercy? Human beings face many claims from religion, and none of them are conclusive. Faith depends on a variety of factors such as family, environment, education, cultural bias, and so on. It has nothing to do with a person's virtue or lack of virtue. How can it be right to torture someone who has committed no crime, nor has complete control over what he believes or doesn't believe? The Quran says that God is the most merciful of those who show mercy, and that his mercy envelops all things. But where is this mercy? I am utterly baffled by the word mercy that is so often repeated in the Quran. Does God give it a meaning that is different from the meaning it has amongst humans? It is said that the mercy of God is for everyone in this life, but only for believers in the next life. Well, if that's the case, then his mercy doesn't embrace everything then. It's absent at the very time it is needed most, and when it carries real significance. Criminologists explain that punishment should not simply be revenge, but must have a purpose such as reform or treatment. But what is the purpose of torturing unbelievers without end? If they have a sickness in their hearts, as the Quran says, then why doesn't God cure them? It is said that those who are sent to hell can never be reformed, as the Quran says, if they were sent back, they would return to that which they were forbidden. But doesn't God have power over all things? And if God is truly the most merciful of those who show mercy, then why not just let them die at the very least? What is the point of keeping them alive so they can simply be tortured without end? I remember Sheikh Zindani said in one of his lectures that the unbeliever deserves eternal punishment because he died with the intention that if he were to live forever, he would disbelieve in God forever. But whatever the intention of a person when he dies, his intention may change if his life were prolonged. The unbeliever may become a believer, and the believer may become an unbeliever. So eternal punishment is not because of his intention at the moment of his death, but because God knows his intention will not change even if he lived forever, and God knew that from the start. So if it is the knowledge of God that is the reason for eternity in hell and not our limited actions, then what is the meaning of this life? Isn't God above doing things for no reason? I always used to say that the descriptions of hell in the Quran are merely metaphors and must not be understood literally. But whether those descriptions are metaphors or not, the result is exactly the same, a punishment that causes eternal suffering, whether physical, mental, or spiritual. My questions and doubts continued to multiply. Among them was the following verse in Surah An-Nisa. As for those women from whom you fear rebellion, admonish them, then separate in bed from them, then hit them. Is this really the speech of an all-wise, all-knowing God? Is disciplining a wife by hitting her amongst the divine secrets revealed from heaven? Psychologists agree that hitting your wife is completely unacceptable behavior and is not an effective way of solving marital problems. On the contrary, it can cause psychological harm, as well as being extremely humiliating, even if it is not a harsh beating, as Hadith says. As for those who say it simply means a light tap with a miswak, this turns a serious matter into an absurd farce. Imagine the scene. A husband says to his wife, "Darling, I tried to explain, and I tried temporary separation, but to no effect. So now I want you to stand still for a moment while I make some light taps on your shoulder with this toothpick." It's utterly absurd. I tried many times to make sense of this verse to calm my doubts, but I had no choice other than to be honest with myself. I simply couldn't believe that this was the speech of the creator of the universe. I could no longer ignore the many other verses that caused me turmoil, such as those that allow the possession of slaves and sex with concubines, or that stipulated punishments such as flogging and amputation of hands, or that contain stories that contradict reason such as Gog and Magog trapped behind a wall until the day of judgment, or Solomon and his talking animals, and the jinn who didn't realize Solomon had died until an insect ate his walking stick and he collapsed, the whale that swallowed Jonah, the squadron of birds that defeated an army with stones, the story of Adam and Eve, or the story of Dhul-Qarnayn, which resembles the Alexander myths that are well-known fictions. I felt like I had woken up from a long sleep. The major proof that Islam is true, according to Muslims, is the miraculous linguistic nature of the Quran. But I now ask myself, where is this miracle? All I see are human words. There is nothing I can honestly say is outside human ability. The Quran says, if you are in doubt about what we revealed to our servant, then bring a surah like it. Well, yes, I am in doubt, and it's true I can't bring something like it. But does that mean it is from God? I also can't bring something like Shakespeare's plays. Is this proof they're from God? Each author has his own style, distinct time, and unique environment. If the challenge is to produce works exactly like theirs, then that's impossible, no matter who the author is. However, if the challenge is to produce better works, then this challenge is a matter of opinion. It's like saying, my wife is the most beautiful woman in the world. Bring another like her if you are truthful. It's subject to factors such as emotional attachment and confirmation bias. Even at the time of Muhammad, many Arabs didn't consider the Quran to be a miracle and ridiculed it. They only accepted Islam after a long and violent struggle. Likewise, during the golden age of Islam, there were some scholars and writers who didn't believe in the miraculous nature of the Quran. It's often said that the miracle of the Quran cannot be rejected without a deep knowledge of grammar, language, and eloquence. But if this is true, the opposite is also true. It's impossible to believe in the miracle of the Quran without a profound knowledge of grammar, language, and eloquence. But most Muslims don't understand Arabic, never mind the intricacies of eloquence. Despite this, every Muslim, regardless of his language or level of education, is certain that the Quran is a miracle outside the capacity of humans. The truth is that humans have an instinctive tendency to accept information that is consistent with their beliefs, while not paying equivalent attention to information that contradicts them. As for the scientific miracles so widespread in our day and age, when I looked into them, I soon realized they were nothing more than ridiculous delusions and nonsense. Even the great scientists of the Islamic Golden Age never made such claims. By 2006, my faith had dwindled to the extent that I felt I had to resign from Islamia school, and I got a job teaching over the internet, which allowed me to take care of my children and my aging mother who was suffering from Alzheimer's. I tried to forget all my doubts and just occupy myself with daily duties. However, I didn't notice that depression had crept up on me and that it was gradually increasing. After 3 years, I went to the doctor and she prescribed antidepressant pills, but those pills caused me to attempt suicide. It was the worst moment of my life and a shock to my family, who didn't realize I was going through such an ordeal. They stepped in to relieve me of some of the burdens I had been struggling with on my own, and my brother insisted I stay with him for a while on his farm in the countryside. My stay in the countryside gave me the opportunity to think and meditate. I realized that loss of faith has stages. The first is denial and an insistence that there is no problem. The second stage is anger and blame. Anger at critics of Islam and throwing blame on others. The third stage is a tendency towards reform movements that call for a new understanding. The fourth stage is depression and feeling that there is no purpose to life. The last stage is acceptance of reality and coming to terms with the new situation. I don't have the answers to the big questions such as the meaning of life or if God exists. But I do know I don't believe in Islam nor any religion. In my opinion, all religions are man-made. This doesn't mean I hate Muslims. Quite the contrary, I feel enormous empathy towards them. And I know that most believers are peaceful and good. And I know that religion brings a great deal of comfort to millions. But although I'm not against religion, I do call for the non-interference of religion in the life of an individual, and for freedom of thought and freedom of conscience, and the right of a person to choose what he believes and doesn't believe without punishments, threats, or pressure. Man finds comfort in certainty and doesn't like to admit ignorance. But as the philosopher Voltaire said, doubt is an uncomfortable position, but certainty is an absurd one. Metaphysical matters cannot be known for certain. As a result, humans created religions to give them certainty and peace of mind in a world full of dangers and fears. But if there really is a truly wise God, he would not punish us for not believing in that which we cannot believe. On the contrary, he would want us to be honest with ourselves. Since I became open about my disbelief in Islam, many have accused me of offending God. But I ask you honestly, who is really offending God? The one who says that the merciful of the merciful tortures his creation without end? Or the one who says that if there is a God, he must be higher and greater than that?